By the time the 1960s came around, American cast iron cookware manufacturers were faced with many changes with the way people cooked in the kitchen, and it was beginning to really hurt their yearly income. Many households in America were using the new non-stick pans for cooking, or they were seeing new ways to make dinner, such as heating frozen foods and making things in a microwave oven. Cast iron cookware remained essential in the kitchen, but it became a very small part of the market for cookware, and in fact, it remains that way even today. The other major blow to American cast iron cookware came from other manufacturers, especially cookware makers in countries from Asia and Europe. Cast iron pans from Asia began showing up on store shelves, and because they were often much less expensive than American-made cookware, consumers in America willingly bought them, and they gave Asian makers a sizable amount of the revenue that, until then, had been going to American manufacturers. Because of this, marketers started adding a Made in USA mark to many of their products to appeal to our patriotism and encourage us to buy American rather than foreign. By the 1960s, American cast iron cookware had been reduced to three major manufacturers: Wagner Ware, Birmingham Stove and Range, and Lodge. Griswold and Wagner had both been acquired by Randall Corporation, then sold to Textron, and then sold again to General Housewares in 1969, and the Griswold foundry in Erie, Pennsylvania had shut down completely. The Griswold logo was phased out completely by the end of the 1960s. The production records for Wagner were lost when the company went out of business, but it's believed Wagner was the first cast iron manufacturer to put a Made in USA logo on its pans, likely in the 1960s. Pans with this design were produced by Wagner for the next 20 years until the logo was changed in the 1980s. The Made in USA mark helps to date Unmarked Wagner pans, which only have a description of the size on the bottom. Wagner was the only maker to print out the full spelling of the size on the bottom, using the word inch instead of an abbreviation. And we don't have the exact date Wagner began putting the Made in USA mark on their pans, so we can only estimate it was during the early 1960s. Some Wagner pans from the 1970s have a GHC logo because the foundry was bought by General Housewares in 1969. For the final decade of their existence, they produced the Wagner's 1891 Original Series, which included the new Wagner logo, a Made in USA mark, and instructions on seasoning the pan. However, these instructions aren't very good, as they tell the user to heat the pan at a temperature far too low to burn on a layer of seasoning. This, plus the way these last-generation Wagner pans tend to warp, are reasons why the Wagner's 1891 series are often seen by collectors as poor quality. And finally, after the Ohio foundry closed, Wagner pans were made in China for a very brief period of time before ceasing altogether. In 1966, Birmingham Stove and Range installed a brand new automated production line at their foundry, and this vastly increased their capacity for turning out cast iron pans by the thousands. At just about the same time, they began following in Wagner's footsteps and adding a Made in USA mark to their cast iron pans. However, they didn't add this mark to every single one of their pans. The great majority of BS&R pans from 1967 to the end of their business, when they folded in 1992, did have a Made in USA mark, but a few of their Century Series pans did not. This is a Birmingham Stove and Range No. 10 Century Cookware Series cast iron skillet. The unusual size of 12 and 7/16 inches means it was manufactured after BS&R adjusted the sizes of several of their pans in the mid-1970s. This was done for two reasons: to cut costs by allowing the patterns to fit better into their molds, and also to make the pans more compatible with glass lids from other manufacturers. Despite the fact this piece was made in the 1970s, it doesn't have a Made in USA mark, and this confirms BS&R did not mark every single one of their pans after 1966 with this mark. This also means there definitely was no law or rule requiring the mark to be added to cast iron pans, and rather it was done voluntarily by the manufacturer, and it was done as a marketing move. There are any number of reasons why this pan did not have the Made in USA mark on it. Maybe it was being shipped to a vendor who put their own labels on the pans after buying them from the manufacturer. Maybe it was part of a large batch of pans being produced for commercial use, where it wouldn't matter to the buyer of 20 or 50 or more pans if they were marked Made in USA or not. The reason for leaving out the mark would almost certainly would have been for marketing reasons. In 1967, Birmingham Stove and Range introduced the cornbread skillet, which became a runaway bestseller and was so popular, other companies began imitating it and making their own imitation pans, even Asian makers. BS&R first made this pan without a Made in USA mark, even though they first began producing it in 1967. Instead, they put a patent pending mark on the pan in order to discourage competitors from making their own cornbread pans, but that didn't work. BS&R produced both a full-sized and a 6-wedge size cornbread pan for several years with a patent pending mark before the 6-wedge pan was discontinued and the full-size cornbread skillet was marked with Made in USA. And finally, Lodge Cast Iron added a Made in USA mark to their pans between 1968 and 1969. Pans with this very prominent Made in USA mark were produced by Lodge during the late 1960s into the 1970s, until the time when they added their logo to their pans in the late 1970s. All Lodge pans since then have had a Made in USA mark, and Lodge makes a point of announcing their pans are all made in the USA. However, Lodge enameled Dutch ovens are actually made in China. This is because there are no makers of enameled cast iron left in the United States, and all enameled cast iron is made either in Europe or Asia. Of course, Lodge manages strict quality control standards with its enameled cast iron, and because of this, their enameled cast iron is still as good as you can get, unless you pay 5 to 10 times the price for an enameled cast iron pan from Stobe or Le Creuset. Over the past decade, a number of small makers of cast iron cookware have started up, and they produce quite a few very high quality pans, which they all proudly declare as being made in the USA. Of course, it'll be quite a while before these new companies are able to produce thousands and thousands of pans and sell them at big box stores all around the country. So for now, if you want a modern-day cast iron pan made in the USA, unless you order online from one of the elite specialty cast iron makers, the only other choice to get is still Lodge Cast Iron. What it all comes down to is, if you want to make the investment and get a cast iron pan made in the USA, you can either go with Lodge, which is an excellent choice, or you can get a pan from one of the elite cast iron makers in the USA, which is also an excellent choice. It's really great to be living here in the 21st century where we have these choices. It's true that in 1960 a law was passed to require a Made in USA mark on textile products, but this never applied to cookware, especially cast iron cookware, though modern-day collectors mistook this and assumed the law did apply to cast iron cookware. Several years ago, I produced a video on identifying old cast iron pans, and it was fortunate enough to be seen by many people on YouTube. Unfortunately, I made an incorrect statement in that video, and I want to address this subject. Namely, there never was any law passed in 1960 requiring manufacturers of cast iron cookware to mark their pans with the words Made in USA. I hope this helps to clarify the subject, and I hope you've enjoyed this look at a piece of cast iron history, one that certainly deserves to be remembered, especially when you cook with these pans. Regardless of whether you're using vintage cast iron or modern day, it still comes down to this. When it comes to cast iron pans, find one that's made in the USA, and you'll still be using the finest cookware in the world. Thank you for watching.